Hello and welcome to the Australian Bitcoin podcast. My name is Alex. Pat's here too, and this week we're joined by Piers to talk about some Bitcoin mining news. How you going, Piers?
G'day guys, great to be on again.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. We're super happy to have you here. There's been a lot of news in the last month, and we said we'd bring it to a fortnightly schedule. So here we are, we're back. This time we've decided to just do a bit of a focus on some interesting Bitcoin mining news, and maybe we'll do a bit of an explainer about Bitcoin mining and some of the interesting things that are happening in the space right now at the same time. So to jump straight into some exciting Australian news, we've got the Australian Bitcoin miner Iris Energy, who have recently rebranded to IREN, have just hit a $2 billion market cap. So IREN is a publicly listed Bitcoin mining company headquartered in Sydney, which is where I am. Awesome to see them. And also coming to talk to us at Bitcoin Sydney soon. They operate large-scale Bitcoin mining facilities in Canada and the US. They use 100% renewable energy, and they place their sites near wind, solar, hydroelectric power sources. They're currently the fifth largest public Bitcoin miner in the world, reporting that they operate nearly 10 exahash worth of Bitcoin miners. And really interestingly, they've got huge expansion plans for the rest of this year. And they're seemingly confident they're going to make it to 30 exahash by the end of the year, which is somewhat astounding, really. Like, if you consider that the current largest public Bitcoin miner is Marathon, and they are operating around 30 exahash. With that in mind, we're going to jump into a bit of a little summary of what is Bitcoin mining.
Just to get everybody up to speed before we dive into all of this Bitcoin mining news, we'll give a super brief rundown of why it's important, really. So Bitcoin is a public accounting ledger. It records all of the Bitcoin transactions. And this ledger is added to block by block, creating the blockchain, which you can really just think of as page by page. They're adding a bunch of new transactions each time they add a block. And creating each new block takes energy. And that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin is considered valuable. And the machines that do this are called ASICs, or application-specific integrated circuits. And all you need to really know there is that they are specifically made for this purpose, hardware that only does one thing, and that is try and find Bitcoin blocks. So miners these days, it's a little bit different these days. They choose to cooperate to have a better chance at finding the next block and obviously getting that block reward. So they act together in big pools, mining pools. And recently there's been some concern raised about centralization in these big mining pools. And as we'll find out in the news today, these big miners are getting bigger and bigger. And it's a crucial aspect of Bitcoin because finding these new blocks is an important part of the ongoing operation of Bitcoin. And so people are quite concerned about miners and like to keep an eye on what they're doing. These miners are also rewarded in Bitcoin, of course, which means their treasuries will likely climb as we go into the future. And they're going to become, if they're not already, the primary source of Bitcoin. And that includes a source of Bitcoin for exchanges. Piers, is there anything I've missed? What would you add to this simplified explanation?
Yeah, I think having just spent the weekend socializing with a bunch of friends who know nothing about Bitcoin, all of whom during the conversation, they asked me, well, what do you do for a living? And then I inevitably have to start off with something like, have you ever heard of Bitcoin? And they then say, oh yeah, like cryptocurrencies. And what do you do in Bitcoin? And then I say, I mine Bitcoin. And they just cannot understand what that means. They've got no idea. And so to try and explain it to people who have no context about what Bitcoin is as an asset, or why you're mining something that essentially in their view doesn't exist, it just raises a whole raft of questions. And so even the explanation, which I think is a really good introduction there from you, Pat, as to what it actually is, will, for most people who are brand new to Bitcoin or have no background in it, none of it makes sense. It all feels like jargon to them. So how I try and distill it down even further is to basically say, I take energy that no one else wants or needs or can use, that's wasted otherwise, and I convert it into Bitcoin as my reward for helping to secure the network. So essentially, say I operate as a kind of like a security defense mechanism for Bitcoin to help prove that all the transactions that are happening are valid. That's about as simple as I can make it for people. As soon as you get into more detail than that, the eyes quickly
They drop off.
When I'm talking to business people, it's another matter altogether, because then I can really talk about how I can take a waste product, being energy that, again, has no market, and I can convert it back into money. So I don't specify what type of money, but I just say that I can take any existing energy that you cannot sell to your customers, and I can convert it to money for you.
Interesting. I often hear people talk about, especially like a great analogy as for Bitcoin mining as a lottery. Do you like that as an intro, or trying to explain how the Bitcoin mining process works? If someone's more interested in like the actual how of Bitcoin mining.
I've heard the analogy being used before of one of these Bitcoin mines is essentially printing lottery tickets, and it's having basically a guess about a typical 100 terahash machine, for example, that we use day in, day out. A typical machine that people would buy these days would produce something in the order of, say, 100 trillion lottery tickets per second. So it's 100 trillion guesses per second per machine. And then if you've got a mine like IREN or Riot that has tens of thousands of these machines, it gives you an idea of how many lottery ticket guesses are going on simultaneously. Maybe a better analogy for people who are brand new to Bitcoin might be, it's like the world's biggest game of bingo. You've got a whole bunch of potential numbers to run through that you're really looking for. There's no shortcut to finding out what the right number is that will, by the time you can get to bingo. But if you just keep guessing, you'll get there eventually. The comment about the pools is really interesting, because in the very, very early days, if you had plugged in your laptop, say around about 2009, when the network was first getting started, and you're either Hal Finney or Satoshi Nakamoto, or one of the very, very early few, including one of my mates who did have his laptop plugged in the first 4 years, you could essentially run the Bitcoin software, and roughly every 10 minutes, you and anyone else who was running their laptop had the opportunity to get given directly a 50 Bitcoin reward for having contributed your CPU on your laptop to running the mining software. And of course, that 50 Bitcoin today would be worth about 5 million Australian dollars. So you definitely like to. But these days, of course, there's so much competition for that Bitcoin reward. People build gigantic facilities trying to do this at massive scale. Us as individuals with a handful of machines or one or two machines, we have no hope of being able to openly compete for a block. So we have to organize into groups, which works kind of like an insurance policy. We all contribute a certain amount of hash power or energy, and we get given a reward as a direct proportion to the amount of hash power we've contributed in the pool. It's a bit like insurance in reverse. You all contribute a certain amount of capability into the network, and you get a proportionate reward based on how much the pool itself has received as block reward.
Yeah, and I think the actual term like mining pool actually drew inspiration from a lottery pool, where you would buy with a group of friends. You maybe buy lottery tickets together, and then you share the reward. And so what miners want to do, because they're operating a business, they want to reduce the amount of risk, and they would much rather have a smaller but consistent payout for the amount of work that they do and the energy that they expend, versus like a very infrequent, hard to predict larger payout. The other one that that you hit on as well is the definition of a hash rate. Before, you were saying you're printing lots of lottery tickets. And the way to think about what hash rate is, and when we mentioned just before with IREN that they're currently at around 10 exahash, and they're moving by the end of the year hopefully to 30 exahash from the sounds of things. Hash or exahash is just a measure of a Bitcoin miner's hash rate, which is essentially how many times they're able to do a hash. But think of it in terms of how many lottery tickets you can print per second. And exahash is, I've got it here, 1 exahash is a 1 followed by 18 zeros. So, and then apparently that's roughly equivalent to the power use of 200,000 refrigerators.
Yeah, that's how much power the current generation of machines would use to produce that many exahash, or that amount of hashes. We have an effect that flows through. You may have heard of a concept called Moore's law. It was an observation by the founder of Intel, who made computer chips, that roughly every year and a half, the average amount of compute power per chip would roughly double. So that same Moore's law seems to be continuing to carry true, especially in the production of mining machines. Yeah, when I first started mining, the state-of-the-art machine was an S19 with 100 terahash of hash power for 3,000 watts of energy. And today you can get a machine that produces roughly 234 terahash for the same amount of energy. So you can see how it's not an exact match, but there's a similar process going on in the efficiency of Bitcoin miners. We're going to see both energy consumption as a whole grow over time, and we're going to see probably an exponential rise in the amount of hash rate that's produced for that energy.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. Let's push on with some news. Pat, what have you got?
So we have some further news in the Trump becoming a Bitcoiner narrative. He's actually met with some US Bitcoin mining executives organized by Bitcoin Magazine, of all people. And they led a fundraiser for Trump's campaign. They met with Riot and some other big miners, and they were pledging support for Bitcoin miners in the US. Of course, Trump was saying famously now that he wants all the future Bitcoin to be mined in the US to maintain their energy dominance. And they're likely going to be speaking at Nashville Bitcoin Conference. It's really positive to see this. I mean, there's big inroads being made into the bigger, wider story of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining in particular. And Trump is actually the first president of the USA to accept Lightning donations for his campaign. And I saw in retaliation for this, Biden actually started accepting crypto payments for his campaign.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't seen that. That's interesting.
What does his anti-crypto army think about that?
Yeah.
I'm not too sure.
It's being quickly disbanded. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly interesting. We've seen over the last sort of couple of months that the Bitcoin's rising as a political issue in this upcoming US election. How have we got to this point where Bitcoin mining is it's such big business that it is Bitcoin mining executives are relevant to presidential candidates?
I think it's due to literally the economic power that they now wield. Yeah, I guess it's no secret that the US election system works very much coin operated. You have these political action committees, which we're relatively unfamiliar with the same term here in Australia, but you have these, I guess, abilities to get in front of candidates by raising the enormous amounts of capital that are needed to fight an election these days. So when you represent an industry that generates this kind of turnover and has this amount of investment, that's a ticket for someone who's campaigning to get access to funding. It's kind of crazy that this amount of funding's been sort of turned away by so many other candidates. Trump's just, I guess, been clever enough to see that there was money there and was happy to follow it.
Is more mining in the US a good thing?
We're doing a little bit here in Australia, myself and my industry colleagues, to make sure not all the Bitcoin is mined in the US. And essentially the economics of Bitcoin mean that wherever energy is available inexpensively and is otherwise wasted, and there's the ability for people like me to operate, we're going to make use of that power and generate Bitcoin. So there is no likelihood that the US is going to be the only producer of Bitcoin. We're not going to see that level of centralization because energy itself is not centralized. It's probably the most decentralized commodity we have. So there's every continent, every city, every place on Earth has the potential to produce energy. So that means inherently we're going to have a very wide distribution of, geographically at least, of where Bitcoin gets made. Now, where the economics make the most sense, probably right now, if I was to pick anywhere on Earth that I could set up and operate, probably the path of least resistance would be Texas. So it's not surprising that you're seeing such a high share of hash rate in several US states, which are a lot more Bitcoin friendly than many other jurisdictions, including Australia, which certainly doesn't make it easy by comparison.
So ERCOT, who is the grid operator for Texas, has recommended to the Texas Senate Committee on Business and Commerce that all Bitcoin mining should be integrated into the Texas grid to help balance load as a controllable load resource. So currently, a sort of small percentage of Bitcoin miners in Texas operate in this way, and Bitcoin mining has really demonstrated itself to be uniquely capable in ramping up or down as needed to help balance the grid. Piers, who's sort of fairly prominent Bitcoiner in the space, he also is head of research at Riot, which is one of the large Bitcoin miners in Texas. He explained that it means that the grid operator ERCOT tells them to ramp up or down to target a certain energy draw. So the way that they control the grid and they keep the energy demand and supply balanced in managing the grid is that they tell generators of energy to scale up or down their production of energy. With Bitcoin, it's very easy to tell. Bitcoin miners are drawing energy off the grid, of course, but they can very easily scale up or down their operations, either using less energy or entirely switching off. There's quite a lengthy process involved to get involved in these controllable load resource programs. ERCOT, the grid operator, is seeing the unique benefits of mining for the grid and are saying, hey, we want more of this. So I guess throwing over to Piers, like what is it about Texas in particular that you think makes it so uniquely suited to Bitcoin mining, and how do you view this news?
Energy is probably one of our biggest costs, and so we're really economically incentivized to find the cheapest energy. And cheap energy is the energy that's not contested. There's no other potential buyer for that energy. And so the ideal place to go looking for energy that's not contested is the energy that was overbuilt in certain physical areas that cannot be shipped anywhere else. And Texas and the ERCOT grid are kind of a unique environment in the US, and this is basically an island of energy production. That most of the other states, from what I understand, have interconnections between their grids and neighboring states, whereas to my understanding, it has no other connections to other states. And there's definitely up towards the northwestern part of the state, there's a whole bunch of renewable energy projects that have been built out and produce a large amount of power. And a lot of this power is being produced very, very far from where the demand load is for that power. And so the way the grid is constructed, there are different choke points where you cannot actually transport the totality of that power to the load centers that want to pay for it. And so perfect place to set up your mining operation would be in that vicinity of those power stations that are currently curtailed or literally can't produce power and export it where it needs to go. Another concept that people probably struggle to understand is that when you build out a grid to serve a population, you can't really take any shortcuts because the energy on the grid must be perfectly balanced at all times. The amount of supply and the amount of demand must be continuously equal. And it's not like you can build a grid that works 90% of the time. You have to build a grid that, from a customer perspective, a retail customer, they can get heating or cooling in hot and cold months whenever they want it. We have an expectation now as humans sitting in our homes that we flick a switch and our fridge turns on, or anything we want to do with our power just works. And so for that, grid operators and grid designers have to build out energy infrastructure such that we can meet 100% of our peak load requirements at all times. But as we all know, we only use that 100% of capacity very small periods of the day. These grids have to build out to a certain amount of capacity. Now, the great thing with Bitcoin mines, because we can turn off and sacrifice our power during those peak periods, because we can essentially provide a customer for all of that additional excess capacity that has to be built in. We can soak up that power production and pay some money for that power 24/7 until there's a customer who will pay more than we will for that same energy, such as you when you come home and turn on your oven. And so that's why ERCOT in particular is a great place to operate. First of all, they actually encourage Bitcoin mining because they can see that it actually helps stabilize the grid. So there's very few hurdles. It's very easy to get, I would say, what I would call a social license to operate. There's a general understanding amongst the community that this is a good thing. It's not something to immediately pull out the garlic and the crucifix and say no to. And that makes it a lot easier to get started with an operation.
Yeah, in Texas, I know that they have a free market for energy, or at least a relatively deregulated market. And so that means that every 5 minutes, the price of power is set. The interesting thing that is also mentioned by ERCOT in that video is just this idea of ancillary services. And if these formal controllable load balancing or controllable load resource programs, do you think something like that might be something that is rolled out more widely? Obviously, we seem to see it widely used in Texas, but do you think this is something that's going to become sort of a standard part of the business model for large miners?
It's basically, you look at any modern grid anywhere in the world, you'll find some form of equivalent program, including in Australia. So, yeah, I'm aware of people that are operating Bitcoin mines on this basis here in Australia right now. And they're able, through curtailment, to make use of these curtailment programs where the grid actively buy back your electricity at times when there are customers who want to pay more for it than you do. And as a result, these companies are making a significant portion of their money, not from Bitcoin mining, but from these incentives to turn off at peak market pricing. So essentially, if you're a Bitcoin miner and you enter into something called a power purchasing agreement, you've essentially pre-purchased electricity at a fixed market rate per kilowatt hour. So let's say, for example, you bought 24 hours of power at 8 cents per kilowatt hour, and then the market value for 5 minutes during that day shoots up to 100 cents per kilowatt hour, which it does do on the spot market. You have the opportunity as a Bitcoin miner, because you pre-purchased that power at 8 cents, to sell it back when the spot price hits 100 cents and make 92 cents of profit. And that's exactly what happens. There's an opportunity to cut off the power very, very quickly, and you'll get paid a premium if you can respond in a fraction of a second. You can get paid a little bit less of a premium if you can respond, say, within a minute or 5 minutes. Where this also becomes interesting is when you consider that most grids are made up of a mix of power sources. And some of those power sources also have an inability to turn off as quickly as the demand reduces on the network. So, for example, a coal-fired power station, you just don't shut them down. You can't ramp them up or down at all. They're basically providing a baseload power. But there will come a point during the day when the sun starts to shine brilliantly and the wind goes, and then all of a sudden you have these other forms of energy that come online, and then you have these gas peaker plants that can turn on or off. They can respond a little bit more quickly. But the type of load that can be removed quickly from the network is definitely Bitcoin mining. We're the fastest load that can come offline and come back online that you can find.
And I think the important thing is that because you're doing these 100,000, I guess, individual processes per second, if you turn off in the next second, that doesn't interrupt the ones you previously started because they're already finished.
Correct.
Whereas in a lengthy process, if you stop it halfway through, like a large-scale industrial thing, then you spoil the entire job. So I think that's the crux of where that huge advantage for Bitcoin mining comes from. Awesome. Let's jump on to the next news item.
All right, so we've got some more Bitcoin mining news in terms of the big players are getting bigger. Riot is the third biggest Bitcoin mining company by market cap, and they have made an unsolicited offer to Bitfarms, who is also a very big Bitcoin miner, for $950 million to acquire their company. But they've rejected this due to it being an undervaluation. So Riot CEO Jason Les is actually calling for the resignation of Bitfarms chairman and interim CEO Nicholas Bonta. And he's claiming there's poor governance and poor public shareholder management. But these were labeled hypocritical by Bitfarms. Bitfarms fired back against the governance of Riot, citing their low ratings, actually as low as 0.4 out of 10 from one advisory firm. So if successful, this merger would lead to the world's largest publicly listed Bitcoin mining company. But Bitfarms is concerned about more than just money, and they've actually adopted an interesting defensive strategy to prevent this hostile takeover. The poison pill tactic, also known as shareholder rights plan, is used by publicly listed companies to make it prohibitively expensive to try and take over that company by buying up public shares. So if a single entity, in this case Riot, obtained more than 15% of Bitfarms through shares purchased, then everybody else except Riot will be able to purchase more shares for themselves at quite a nice discount. So this dilutes their attempt to buy up a controlling share in the company by making it a lot more costly. And this tactic also secures the Bitfarms board more time to act, negotiate, and think of ways to help benefit the public shareholders and increase the company's share price. So Riot are very determined to buy up Bitfarms. We're not going to see this go away, I don't think. And stories like this are a little bit concerning, as we've mentioned centralization concerns earlier.
This is an interesting story. So this is potentially the first hostile takeover attempt we've seen in the public Bitcoin mining space, which is quite interesting. Riot attempted to make an offer, but at the same time, they've been acquiring shares of Bitfarms, and they've actually reached that 15% threshold now. And so a hostile takeover is where you attempt to buy out the shares and internally control the company. I guess the question that we want to jump into, and what's interesting, is why are we seeing this sort of mergers, acquisitions, this consolidation in the mining sector post-halving? It's been a couple of months now. Maybe you haven't heard, but there's a general expectation that this is sort of a period of consolidation for miners. What's behind this?
The economics of mining at this kind of scale are such that you need fantastic energy, you need a really good execution team, but most importantly, you need access to vast amounts of capital to cover up for your mistakes. So this is probably more about getting as close to too big to fail as you possibly can. So you need to have an enormous amount of capital to run business at this scale. I've actually physically been to the Rockdale facility for Riot about 2 years ago. It's maybe a 2-hour drive out of Austin, Texas. And
this is the largest Bitcoin mining facility in the world, right?
It was at the time. I think
it's
been eclipsed by the second largest one, a couple of hours away from that facility. These facilities are mind-bogglingly huge. The scale of the operations is just hard for anyone who's not been there to comprehend. These facilities are probably some of the largest industrial facilities I've seen in my lifetime of any kind, regardless of industry. So for context, I walked through a shed of 20,000 ASICs, and there were 8 of these sheds on that site. They've got a mixture of both immersion-based mining sheds as well as air-cooled, almost a gigawatt of energy supplied to it. These things are just gigantic. So, it doesn't surprise me that we're going to see mergers, acquisitions, and consolidation. There are some economies of scale to be achieved in mining when you're operating at that level, and it will make sense for the miners that aren't performing as well to be absorbed by those that are. But I think the next problem with all these takeovers is we're going to end up with, like we have in almost every other sector, you've got number 1, number 2, and then a distant number 3, and then a whole bunch of rounds. And that's where we're headed.
In a similar story, CoreScientific declines $1 billion buyout from CoreWeave. CoreWeave is a privately held cloud computing provider who wanted to buy up all of CoreScientific, one of the largest in the US. CoreScientific actually recently emerged from bankruptcy with new leadership, but their stock price has been performing well recently. Instead of the takeover, they've agreed to a series of 12-year contracts to provide 200 megawatts of CoreWeave's operations. CoreScientific was offered $5.75 per share, which is actually about half the market value. And it was unanimously declined and seen as against the best interests of public shareholders. So the estimated annual revenue from these agreed upon contracts is expected to be around $290 million per year for CoreWeave. And it's an interesting case because we're seeing that AI computing is now competing with Bitcoin miners for energy and hardware. And this could cause a pretty significant rise in energy prices. I guess that leads to Bitcoin miners seeking more cheap and stranded power, which is a good thing. Now, ownership of these sites with its ready-to-go infrastructure is very valuable for AI companies who often pay a lot more to rent computing. Piers, why are these Bitcoin miners being bought out by these AI companies?
The kind of compute that you see with AI is building these large language models and doing lots and lots of compute, batch computing. Yeah, it's interruptible to some extent. It can be done asynchronously from a demand from a customer to some extent, meaning that it's not like a traditional data center. It's more akin to Bitcoin mining, but you do need more access to network resources than you do, say, in a Bitcoin mine. In a Bitcoin mine, we can get off with a 4G connection. But with AI, you do need a more reliable bandwidth and you need better latency than is typically acceptable with Bitcoin mining, more bandwidth. At a typical data center, you're paying roughly about 30 cents per kilowatt hour for your power. So in some cases, up to 40 cents per kilowatt hour for highly, highly reliable power. But AI and producing these large batches of calculations doesn't have the need for that level of physical security or redundancy and availability. So a lot of it can be displaced to similar compute environments to where Bitcoin is being done at the moment. And because Bitcoin, we tend to go after the lowest possible forms of power cost, those energy prices look really, really attractive if you're trying to produce these AI models and do training. So that's why I think we're going to see more and more competition for Bitcoin miners that have already nicely set themselves up in a great source of power. If they also have the conditions that are suitable to operate as AI, I think a lot of, ultimately going to get paid more per kilowatt hour to do AI than you are to do Bitcoin mining. And so you're going to see more and more of that getting displaced. And you're seeing that right now with the story around IREN, who have made use of their energy allocation, and their data centers are designed to operate in both modes. So they can actually do a mix of Bitcoin and AI calculations.
There's this massive AI arms race going on, and it's about scaling up as quickly as possible. And they've realized that suddenly we don't have the data center capacity to support our expansion plans. So you're going to see probably more and more competition over the next couple of years as AI companies look to either take over or look to be hosted in Bitcoin mining facilities. I think the other thing that's interesting, I was just interested in your take on it, Piers, is like in terms of power density, like how traditional data centers differ from Bitcoin mining facilities and how that plays into them being more suitable for AI compute as well.
Yeah, so before I got into Bitcoin mining, I was operating in traditional data center facilities of the type that you would see here in Australia. Most customers would start out with a 3 kilowatt allocation. In other words, just enough to be able to run one Bitcoin mine. And they're running an entire stack of servers, these sort of pizza box style Dell servers in a rack like that. If you really fill up your rack and you put lots and lots of equipment in there and traditional compute equipment, you're probably going to reach somewhere in the order of 4 to 5, maybe 6 kilowatts. Not every rack can actually be provisioned with 6 kilowatts of power necessarily. Sometimes the data center has to reroute power in order to give you more power at your rack. You typically get an allocation of 3 kilowatts per standard rack. In the data centers where I've subsequently operated to build Bitcoin mines, you're looking at densities around about the 16 to, in some cases, even 100 kilowatts per rack.
Okay, so a significant multiplier on top of what a normal data center would.
Yeah. You cannot operate viably a Bitcoin mining or probably even an AI facility at those power densities in a facility like that, particularly with what you pay for power, because, again, those facilities are optimized for uptime and they're optimized for redundancy, because they've all been designed for a different paradigm of compute, which was all about 99.999999% uptime. So they're built for reliability. Whereas today's paradigm for compute is about, all equipment eventually goes down. You will have outages. So simply design your software so that it's resilient against an outage in a particular data center. So a lot of that traditional data center infrastructure has been designed and built for an earlier age of software development and compute requirements is probably going to find itself supplanted by this new paradigm where it's actually more about cheaper and more remotely located data centers.
Moving on to more news, OKX Crypto Exchange has bid against itself and massively overpaid on fees. So OKX is a crypto exchange, shitcoin exchange, and they made a bit of a blunder with their fees. They've massively overpaid when trying to consolidate around 350,000 inputs across a total of 2,385 individual transactions. This has cost them a total of 254.28 Bitcoin in fees, which is that's insane, which is about 25 million Australian dollars, at an average fee rate of 246 sats per VByte, causing massive congestion and fee spiking in the mempool. And this all occurred because of a faulty transaction automation software they've been running, which has seen the exchange bidding against themselves for limited block space. So someone's put down a bid, and then you've put down a bid, and then you've put down a bid against yourself, and then you've gotten into a frenzy, driven up the fees, and they've paid the price. So I guess there's a few things that come out of this, maybe for people who aren't super familiar with how the mempool operates and how Bitcoin transaction fees work. Which maybe let's start simple. Like Pat, like what are transaction fees?
Transaction fees are essentially an incentive to the miner. You need to pay to use the network. The miners, of course, get the block reward, but people also pay their individual fees. And this is so that in the far future, when the Bitcoin reward is much, much less, there will still be these transaction fees to keep the miners happy and make sure that people are willing to support the network.
Yeah. So Bitcoin blocks have a limited size. So we can only fit so many transactions in each Bitcoin block. And of course, each Bitcoin block is on a roughly 10-minute schedule. That's probabilistic, so it doesn't mean it's always going to be every 10 minutes, but on average, it's going to tend towards being about every 10 minutes. And so there's actually a fixed throughput in terms of how many transactions can be in a block. And so one of the things that transaction fees does is it gives a way to order or prioritize which transactions actually get included in a block. And so Bitcoin miners, they're running a business, or they're at least they're trying to be profitable and get a return on providing a service to the Bitcoin network. One of the key ways they earn their reward is that they select the most profitable transactions or the highest fee paying transactions. Yeah. And mempool, what is the mempool, Piers?
Mempool is where transactions go and they sort of stay there in a sort of holding pen until they get picked up by miners. So if you're a miner, the way you look at these transactions, you order them based on how high a fee they're paying. So if I want to maximize how much money I get paid to do the mining operation itself, I want to prioritize the people who've bid the most to put their transaction into my block. And the mempool is essentially distributed across everybody who is running a node. So there actually is no one single mempool. In fact, each mining pool that operates out there runs its own version of the mempool. They tend to have bigger, beefier machines than you or I might have to capture as many of these pending transactions as possible. But when you issue a new transaction and it appears to be stuck and you can't seem to get your Bitcoin to go from wallet A to wallet B, that's probably because you underpaid the fee and you tried to be a little bit cheap about how much you would pay as a fee. And if you want to get your transaction to go faster, then obviously, pay as much as you think is efficient for you to do so.
Cool. And Pat, can you explain to me what a sats per VByte is? So in here, as I mentioned, that they paid an average of 246 sats per VByte. Is that cheap or is that a lot?
That is a lot. I think the average at the moment is around 15 to 30 sats per VByte, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it's going up recently. A Satoshi, I think most people will understand that. It's a small amount of Bitcoin. It's kind of like the cents for Bitcoin. And a VByte is a virtual byte. So one byte is 8 ones or zeros. And it's just a measure of how much space your transaction actually takes. Some transactions are a bit more complicated than just, I'm going to send this amount to over here. They may have different functions happening inside that transaction. It may be a bit more complex. That means it takes up more space in the block. And so you pay for that space you're taking up.
Most people probably are already aware of this, but one of the key things that differentiates Bitcoin and makes it so interesting is that you're not paying based on value. It's not a percentage of the value being transferred. It's actually you pay based on how much space you take up in the blockchain. So how much data, and a very large volume transaction, say, we're talking like 100 Bitcoin transaction, that may actually take up a very small amount of space compared to, say, a smaller transaction with multiple signatures or a complex script. I guess a question for Piers maybe is like, why is OKX doing this huge consolidation transaction to begin with? Why are they even in this position?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting ratio. 350,000 inputs or UTXOs, individual coins or chunks of Bitcoin, if you like, for 2,385 individual transactions. That says to me that you've got roughly 100 UTXOs per actual transaction that you want to send. So when you have lots and lots of inputs to a transaction, that makes part of the transaction itself, which means that you can end up with a very, very long set of letters and numbers that make up your transaction that needs to be hashed and confirmed on the block. And if you're making up a whole bunch of these tiny little fragments of Bitcoin and trying to describe that on your transaction, and you're paying for that length, then obviously it's expensive to move these around. So I guess you continuously, as an exchange, you continue to have potentially a mismatch between the amount of individual bits of Bitcoin versus the size of the transactions you actually want to move. So by consolidating them, you do make it so that you have fewer chunks of Bitcoin that you need to move to satisfy the transaction sizes your customers want to move from wallet to wallet. In theory, that should actually make the amount you spend on fees as an exchange cheaper. But if you miscalculate what you're offering, then you end up defeating the purpose of the consolidation in the first place.
In this case, the error was that they had a poor fee estimation algorithm, which is, I guess, the way that they predict what fee they need to be included in a block. And so what they've done is they've included their own transactions as part of their fee estimation. So each subsequent transaction they've listed, they've looked at what the existing transactions are that they need to outbid, and they keep trying to outbid themselves. As part of the video, maybe Pat will drop in a little image, some great images floating around of the mempool and the little unicorn horn spike in the mempool. It's probably one of the highest fee rates we've seen, excluding maybe the halving block and the immediate following blocks, but one of the highest fee spikes we've seen in recent times for sure. Yeah. Awesome. Well, on to our final news article, which is we've had a bit of a two-tiered fee market going on, so a bit more of a discussion of fee markets, and that is Bitcoin is currently operating a two-tier fee pricing system. So Mononaut, who's reliable investigative reporting from mempool.space, has reported that transactions that use signature operations or SIGOPs currently need to pay over, this is a couple of days ago now, need to pay over 100 sats per VByte to get into the next block, while some transactions that cost 0 SIGOPs can get away with less than 30 sats per VByte. The reason for this is that Bitcoin consensus rules enforce two separate resource limits for blocks, which is 4 million weight units, which is that block limit size, basically limits the total possible size of a block. So that's one limit. But there's also another key limit, and that's 80,000 signature operations or SIGOPs. At the moment, there's an SR20 mint, a spammers protocol that's working on top of Bitcoin, causing lots of what's called stamp transactions that are consuming the entire SIGOP limit. So these are quite small transactions that aren't using a lot of data, but they are using a lot of signature operations. What actually is a SIGOP? Like, what is a signature operation? In a Bitcoin transaction, obviously we've got a public key and a private key. And part of that is that we need to demonstrate that we are the owners of the private key to move the funds that are associated with a public key or an address. And the way we do that is with a digital signature. So using the private key, we create a digital signature which signs the transaction saying, I authorize moving the funds from here to here. So essentially a SIGOP is used every time you need to check a signature. And these are part of the Bitcoin script. When you make a transaction, will include these SIGOPs. However, not all transactions are required to include a SIGOP. So you can actually, interestingly, construct a transaction which just moves funds from X to Y but it doesn't actually require a signature. Maybe it requires some other kind of form of validation. And so one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is that these stamps are bidding up the fees very high to consume a lot of the block related to SIGOPS. And then we're having a lot of the spam from this protocol called runes fill up the remaining weight in the block. And the reason for that is that the runes actually don't require any SIGOPS. And so blocks don't normally get close to the SIGOP limit, which means that the 4 million weight limit is normally what is decisive in determining what goes in and out of a block. And that's because normal transactions use proportionally more weight or more data than they do SIGOPS in terms of contributing towards those limits. However, the stamps protocol embeds data and legacy, what we call band multi-sig outputs, which you don't need to worry about really, but all you need to know is that they disproportionately use a lot of SIGOPS relative to the data they use. So what you have is you have this dynamic where you have some small transactions which are taking up a large percentage of the block SIGOPS, and then other transactions which don't consume SIGOPS and just fill up the rest of the block. What's resulted is this almost two-tier fee market where the zero SIGOP transactions are the only ones competing for the leftover weight, resulted in this two-tiered pricing effect. So I guess what is interesting about this is that I think it really highlights who decides what goes in blocks, which transactions go in blocks.
Question for me?
I guess. Piers. Pat.
Yeah. Well, this is, I guess, the big debate between Stratum V1 and Stratum V2, which is in the current model that most of us operate under, miners themselves, people actually operating the hash power, actually aren't the people deciding what transactions goes in the block. We're essentially fed a template directly from whichever mining pool that we've signed up our individual miners to. So for us, as hash providers, that's really what miners are these days, under the Stratum V1 market construct that we're operating under. We don't really know, care, or have any visibility over any of this. We're essentially just fed a template, and that template already contains the transactions. In the current market structure, I would say the answer to that is it's the mining pool that you've pointed your hash power at that gets to make that decision. So we could obviously decide if we don't like how that mining pool is operating, we can, at a moment's notice, redirect our hash power to a different mining pool. So we have an influence over what transactions go into blocks more generally, but we're going to be economically incentivized to go to whoever pays us the most for our hash power. Stratum V2 obviously changes this dynamic a bit, and it moves the ability to form our own block templates or have influence over them back onto the miner's side if we choose to do so. And that's what I guess people are excited about the move to Stratum V2 is. It helps to decentralize that role and move out from these very large and very concentrated mining pools, that ability to decide what transactions constitute consensus or not.
For those that potentially haven't heard of it before, Stratum is the protocol that miners follow to talk to each other and basically conduct the mining process. And so Stratum V1 was the original implementation of the protocol, which puts a lot of effort or responsibility on the mining pools to decide which goes in a block. And then Stratum V2 is something that was proposed in around, I think, 2018 or 19. It's been being worked on for many years now. And it's just starting to reach the point where it's ready for it to be rolled out and tested, and moves that responsibility back to the individual miners to decide what goes into a transaction. Okay, well, that's it for the news for this fortnight. We've covered exclusively mining news this fortnight. Thanks very much to Piers for joining us, our mining expert. Will you be up at the Cairns Bush Bash, Piers?
I will be. I'll see you there.
I'll see you there, yeah. Piers runs MineRacks, which is a mining hosting facility in Brisbane. Tell us a little bit about MineRacks, Piers.
Yes, I started out offering a hosting facility to people that wanted to mine during the heyday of 2021, and particularly during the China miner ban. The economics became such that anyone could just plug in a miner if you could get your hands on one, and it was just spewing out Bitcoin, and set up a facility there to help make that happen for not only myself, but for anyone else that wanted that option, to do that here in Australia rather than sending a mine overseas or hoping that cloud mining would work out for them. And subsequent to that, certainly got bitten by the bug and got involved in producing and helping out other energy companies develop mining operations of their own, and also got very passionate about how custody works, have both developed and helped people with tooling around multisig in particular, and how to secure multisig stacks for I guess, anyone who's interested in holding onto Bitcoin, but equally for businesses and organizations, from publicly listed organizations right through to small business, how to look after their Bitcoin.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, Piers has done some awesome sort of demos and walkthroughs of how to DIY your own multi-sig and some of the best practice around that at the Bush Bash, and then also at Bitcoin Alive recently. So, so the upcoming Bush Bash is actually at the end of next month. So if you're interested, come along to Cairns, Palm Cove. You'll be able to meet Piers himself. I'll be there myself as well. But if people want to get in contact with you, Piers, how can they find you?
DMs are open at MineRacks, either on Telegram or on Twitter X.
Awesome. All right, cool. Let's round it out there. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next fortnight.
Thanks, everybody.